So we're going to go ahead and get started. We'll hopefully this will be incentive for folks outside to hustle and grab food and get over here. For those of you online, apologies for our delay. Our food was delayed, and obviously you can't have a hungry audience, otherwise the questions are a lot harder and angrier. So we decided to feed our audience, and we will go ahead and get started. So thanks all for joining us today. I think this is, as Ben pointed out, this is quite good timing. We planned it perfectly to wait for the waiver, the exemption of CATSA for India to sort of have this conversation on the military-industrial component of the U.S. India partnership. And this idea sort of came out of a conversation that I had with Air Marshal Matheswaran back in April. We were at the International Studies Association annual conference. We've bumped into each other a lot at academic conferences, which speaks a lot to his experience and his sort of like wide range of interests. And we started talking a little bit about the U.S.-India partnership and some of the hang-ups and pitfalls that we had observed, and this question of how to balance near-term objectives of the U.S.-India partnership, which at least from the U.S. side was in large part about balancing China, or we can sort of, the more PC way to put it is like for India to become a net security provider in the Southern Asia, Indian Ocean region, with the long-term sort of objective of this being a sustainable enterprise for India so that they're not burning themselves out on defense acquisitions and defense spending, and actually sort of be able to maintain a healthy balance between economic growth and generating hard power. And that sort of led to these conversations about how the U.S. could facilitate that and what sort of the interests are from the U.S. side and from the Indian side. And so he just has a very unique perspective, having served in the military, been part of the acquisitions process as an advisor, and was one of the original authors, the RFI for the MMRCA back in 2004, as we just learned. And also sort of being on the academic, intellectual side, starting a think tank in Chennai, having some long experience working at IDSA as well. So he comes at it from multiple angles, and I'm really excited that he's here to join us today. So I'll quickly go through the biographies of Matheswaran as well as our other two discussants, and then we'll go ahead and get started. So Air Marshal M. Matheswaran retired from the Indian Air Force in 2014 after 39 years in military service. In the last appointment, he was Deputy Chief of the Integrated Defense Staff for 23 months at the Tri-Service Headquarters in the Ministry of Defense. Since then, he has held defense and aerospace consulting positions at Hindustan Aeronautics Limited and Reliance Defense. He's the founder and chairman and president of the Peninsula Foundation, which is the think tank for security and policy research based in Chennai, so outside the Delhi orbit. To my right, we also have Ben Schwartz, who leads the U.S. India Business Council's Defense and Aerospace Program, where he advocates for pro-trade policies before officials in the Indian and American governments. He previously served in a range of positions within the U.S. national security community, including the Department of Defense, Department of State, Department of Energy, in the Department of Defense, where he was Director for India in the Office of Secretary of Defense. And then finally, we have Professor Joanna Spear, who's an Associate Professor of International Affairs and Director of the FAO Regional Sustainment Initiative at the Elliott School at GW. Her areas of focus include U.S. and U.K. arms sales policies, U.S. counterproliferation policies, transatlantic relations. In 2012, she was a senior visiting fellow at IDSA in the Institute for Defense Studies and Analyses in New Delhi, working on India's arms import policies and offset strategies. And that's actually where we first met, despite the fact that we were both at GW at the time. And so I'm really glad we got this collection of folks together. So with that, I'll ask Air Marshal Matheswaran to speak maybe for about 15 to 20 minutes, and then we'll turn it over to discussants. And then after you guys are perfectly satiated with your lunch, you can come at us with some hopefully softball questions.
Thank you, Sami. It's a pleasure to be here. Good afternoon to everyone. The topic is particularly of great relevance with the good news that Ben brought today, that the CATSA is out of the way for India's relationship with Russia on the defense acquisition side. That's an important development. But let's get back to the main topic, which is military-industrial cooperation between India and the U.S. And I've been involved right from the initial stages when we started. There are two elements to it. One is the military-to-military cooperation, which started after the relations expanded in the 90s, and better understanding between the two countries, and the Cold War had ended, and the Cold War mindset had sort of disappeared. And then you had the two military is exercising quite significantly. The Air Force, U.S. Air Force and Indian Air Force, we've done very good exercises. And I believe the last red flag exercise that we did in Alaska in 2016 was an exceptional one. The Navy's exercise very regularly. You know about exercise Malabar, and of course the Quad is in news quite, regularly in recent times. And the armies have started, exercising quite well. And you must remember that India is, in terms of experience with dealing with, low-intensity conflict. I mean, we've been doing that for more than 30 years, 3 decades now. And the U.S. Army and Indian Army train together quite regularly at one of our jungle warfare school in the Northeast. And that's a regular practice, apart from doing the regular exercises as well. So military to military engagement in terms of defense cooperation has been moving well. Exercises have slowed down in between primarily for the cost and economic considerations, not for anything else. The red flag, which we initially planned to do every 2 years, we pushed it back to every 5 years. It may get moved up again, but that's a good issue. And with respect to the military exchanges in terms of professional courses, that's been, we've been doing that for a long time. But I personally was involved in expanding that portion. We've sent the Indian Air Force officers into the School of Advanced Air Power Studies for the first time in 2009. And I think we are the first country to send people outside of your NATO and your allies. And I think we've sent about 4 or 5 officers so far, and that's a continuous process. Apart from the other, staff college and general staff courses that people come regularly. I'm a test pilot myself. I commanded the Flight Test Center, and for, I would say, almost 4 decades, periodically we've been sending our test pilot trainees to the U.S. schools, both Edwards as well as the Pax River. And that flow back in terms of your experience and the knowledge level has been greatly beneficial to our side as well as the interactive processes, particularly when you come on to the industrial processes. So I think between the 2 countries in this segment of military cooperation, there's been a healthy growth, and it's fairly robust, and I must say it's on the right track. When you come on to the industry side, you all would have read that the business has grown enormously in the last decade plus. From 2005, India has bought equipment worth more than $15 billion, which is a sizable amount. We bought the C-130, C-17s, the Apaches, the Chinooks, and there are a few more on the pipeline. And much of it is through the FMS route. The Apache, of course, is the DCS route. Much of it is, DCS is a direct commercial sales, FMS is the foreign military sales program. Now, you need to look at India's, objectives and issues, and that is what, when we started dealing on the MMRCA with the U.S. Defense Security Cooperation Agency and the Air Force and the Navy from 2004, on the MMRC case particularly, I kept emphasizing that you need to understand what India is looking for. It is not a direct, a relationship of an ally or a client. It's looking at a fair amount of individuality in terms of creating a partnership, and through that partnership addressing a lot of gaps that it has in terms of technology, capabilities. And that can only be addressed through a strong and a robust industrial partnership. So while we have created various mechanisms to enhance cooperation and strengthen the strategic partnership between the 2 countries, I did say in the absence of a strong strategic industrial lock-in between the 2 countries on the military side, your strategic partnership will always be on a weaker foundation. And we still haven't got a very strong industrial collaboration on any platform or technology or program. While on the other hand, on the information technology side, on the research side, there is a significant presence of the American industries in India. You have, General Electric has the largest research facility in India outside of the US, Jack Welch Center in Bangalore. Honeywell has a huge facility, employs enormous amount of engineers. So also Boeing, so also Lockheed Martin will set up some research facility as well. There are many industries that have presence in India as well. But when it comes to military issues, historical factors come into play. One from the Indian policymaker side, Indian bureaucratic side, there is still, at least in the 2005, 2004 time frame, there was still an niggling underconfidence that how do you trust the US? They may pull the rug under your feet anytime. And therefore, would you want to actually put a lot of weight on defense cooperation with respect to military equipment on the US side? It's taken, I think, better part of this decade to get over that kind of, underconfidence. That's primarily, I would call it as a Cold War, legacy. And I think the times have changed. India's position has changed. US, interactions in the globe has changed. And therefore, I think people need to get out of that process completely. The second part is the industry by itself. Now, India had, in the defense industry, had put all its eggs in the public sector, institutions. So the industry was completely dominated by the public sector. And therefore, the private sector innovation, initiative, those aspects were, completely missing, I would say, in the late 90s and right up to the early 2000s. I was part of a committee called Kelkar Committee, which looked at how do we facilitate, the entry of private sector into the whole process. And in the entire over 3-4 years of discussions, we could see the kind of, vested interest coming into play where DPSU said the private sector cannot be trusted. And I think we've come a long way. Now today, the government policies to encourage private sector, bring in level playing field, and as a deputy chief dealing with Defense Acquisition Council, we had made sure that the level playing field is ensured for both private sector and the public sector. So when you now want to bring in, technologies into the country, there are some policy impediments that come into play. One, the uniqueness of US rules, regulations, and laws that come into play. You would have read about the foundational agreement issue with respect to India. You would have also seen with respect to end-user license, end-user agreement. There are also aspects of, US apprehensions about, safety of sensitive technologies. And much of that fear comes from because India's military equipment is largely still Russian origin. We have strong relations with Russian state, as well as we've outsourced a lot of equipment from much of the other parts of the world as well. Britain, France, the French have been a big supplier as well. But this is something that I've seen from the American side is that how do you ensure that our technologies will be safeguarded and it won't fall into the access of, let's say, for the Russian access, etc. And this is what my entire approach has been, that the Indian system has a fair amount of strength in firewalling different segments, and it's very, very strong. And therefore, what it needs, it very clearly establishes the separation between what needs to be in its hands, what needs to be with the partner, and what should not get into some other partner who's not involved with this process. An example I'll give you is the AVAX program that we began. And the AVAX aircraft is a Russian aircraft, the IL-78. The technology that comes into it for the entire AVAX technology is designed, developed by Israel. There's a lot of American components that come into play as well. There's a lot of French products that come into the whole issue. And now, how do we manage this entire process? Because a lot of security sensitivities and different countries get involved. We manage that excellently well. So if we now send the aircraft for upgrade or servicing, we will send it routed back through Israel because they become the overall design authority and program manager. The aircraft gets stripped of all its sensors and technologies, and the airframe is sent out to Russia for overall and then brought back. Israel takes control of the whole process, and everything gets upgraded or serviced and fitted back and sent back to India. And when that process gets established in India as well, the same process will be followed. And we do that in quite a few areas. The French have no issues about working with us. We don't share the French technologies with the Russians, and none of that happens ever. So that confidence level, I think it's taken time to actually, I think that realization has come, and there's a fair amount of confidence in American companies. But how do we now move this into a robust industrial partnership? Now, the problem in India's defense technology issue is that we still continue to be the largest importers of defense equipment. We have one of the largest militaries. Our threat environment is fairly, acute with respect to India. And you have adversaries in China, you have adversaries in Pakistan. And China has catapulted itself in the aerospace technology significantly, and therefore we are up against a high level of technology as well. And if we now continue to depend on imports, it creates a serious vulnerability because your technology routings are outside the country. So your servicings, your supply chain, your critical technologies, you are dependent on somebody else. And that you have to overcome. Any country has to overcome. And no country is going to give critical technologies to any other country without a consideration of strategic interest, without a consideration of being partners in the larger game of strategic interest. And this, I think, is where I think the interest sharing has to come into play by the governments concerned into the entire process. So the example I'll give is we had the MMRCA program. And until the 90s, the Indian defense acquisition was primarily from Russia, and some from the UK, and some from France. But they were all government-to-government decisions. There were no competitive process. And that process came into being with the formation of the Integrated Defense Headquarters, a formalization of the acquisition process. Cold War ended, and India wanted to expand its resources, acquisition sources to rest of the world. And therefore, you brought in a competitive process quite well established. It was quite slow, quite painful, but nevertheless, it's a fairly robust competitive process. And in that competitive process, if you actually put in routine acquisitions, it is fine. But where strategic interests are involved, where huge programs like MMRCA are involved, it is not just the Air Force alone that matters there. And this is how we actually worked on the MMRCA program in 2005 completely. We said the easiest thing to address is the Air Force's operational requirements. That we can define it very well, and we did that. But the larger interest is this program and this acquisition should flow into a manufacturing capability which creates the latest state-of-the-art production facilities in the country. It will also address the development of an ecosystem which is absent in the country, ecosystem of small and medium industries, and should create the kind of partnerships with the foreign OEMs and their subsidiaries into the Indian system. And more importantly, the Indian ecosystem should be able to slot itself into the global supply chain. So this is where the two industrial partnerships should work. And therefore, I believe you really cannot go beyond a certain stage in that competitive process. So I flagged in my file noting, there was a para 73 in the DPP 2005 rather, which says in the high value procurement processes, the Cabinet Committee on Security will finally decide what is of foremost strategic interest to the country in terms of technology, economy, and strategic interests. And therefore, while the MOD and the others would have done the process and declared who's L1, who's L2, etc., it does not matter who's L1 or L2. If the CCS feels that somebody else is going to offer more advantages in terms of strategic terms, and they would be chosen. So the decision making finally was indicated that it will be left to the CCS, but that was not followed. And we know the entire process that went through. And the French were declared the L1, and then they created problems. They said, we can't transfer these technologies. These are not technologies what you mean. And so a whole lot of it dragged on for another 4 years. Finally, it got scrapped. Then we've gone through the 36 Rafale buy. And now the Air Force is seriously short of its force structure, and the government has sent out an RFI all over again. Now, I interacted with General Kohler, who was the head of the DSCA in 2005, and I said, here's an opportunity, and the US has to think out of the box and use this opportunity, because this opportunity comes once in a century of such a huge procurement, and look at it and in building the strategic partnership between the two countries through this industrial lock-in process. But I think that was the beginning stage of U.S. trying to understand what Indian acquisition process was. And therefore, I don't think they could move anything beyond. They didn't want to tamper or they didn't want to do anything beyond what India was articulating through RFP process. But now, you've got a godsend chance again all over again. And I would say, and I've suggested that in some of the track 2 dialogues, and I've even, last time we met, I think I discussed that with you, is that look at what is immediately available and what you're fielding between the 2 OEMs that the US has, that is the F-16 Block 70 that they've offered and the F-18 Super Hornet that they've offered. These are 40-year-old design platforms, although they've been upgraded enormously, and these won't be acceptable as a long-term solutions. And therefore, if you combine that with a larger strategic partnership solution in terms of, let's say, F-35 or as a partner in another development, then the 2 governments can look at it, because that will address the Para 73, which has become Para 104 in the latest DPP 2016. And that is where the governments probably can look at it. Secondly, one is meeting the Air Force's requirement. The second part is the industrial ecosystem development, industrial partnership. The third part is the joint work in research and development programs. If the Indian government is looking at, and they've more or less decided that they will go the AMCA way, which is a 5th generation platform development from India, and the Indian industry, Indian design and development agencies need outside support, need outside partnership. And here's where this acquisition program can actually enable the industry that's selected to also be a risk-sharing partner in that development program. And this is how you will actually be a long-term partner in that entire process. And this is how the countries will evolve. Nobody, like I said, nobody gives critical technologies immediately, but there's a technology diffusion process. There's a learning process. There is a joint development process, a co-design, co-development process. All these have to follow in steps. And this is the problem in the Indian mindset. They don't give enough importance to these areas. And this is what needs to be done. So I've interacted with a fair amount of US Air Force and industry. And they say, okay, the DRDOs will ask for the latest technologies. Sometimes we do try and politely tell them that some of the latest technology you may not be able to absorb because the industries are not capable of absorbing. You have to go through certain stages of development. And I fully agree with that. Classic example is the Kaveri engine development. We've taken 30 years plus and we still haven't got it flying. The reason is this. You haven't gone through the first few steps. You haven't made a single aero engine before. I think I wouldn't call one needs to decide whether it's brave decision to go into a 4th generation, 4.5 generation engine design as your first venture, or is it foolhardy? Okay, so I think these aspects will have to be, both sides understand this, but I think instead of staying back, both sides will have to discuss that a little more openly and give the confidence to each other. And if you do that, a lot of industrial joint ventures and industrial partnerships will develop. And the latest announcements, the government has said we will create 2 defense corridors, one in the north and one in the south from Chennai, Bangalore, Coimbatore areas. The quality of manpower is available, capabilities available. They need that enabling environment to bring in smaller industries into the space areas, into the supply chain areas, and then gallop across into the next level of design development as joint partners. I think that should work. There are a lot of examples across the world countries who followed this model successfully. And this is what I've also indicated in one of the reports I gave to the government in 2014. And I think it's been taken in the right spirit. Let's see how it moves along.
1959, that was almost exactly 20 minutes. Well done. I'll turn it over to Ben for some initial comments.
Well, first, thank you for the invitation to be on the panel today. I think what we just heard was a lot of very important components that make up India's sort of perspective with respect to the United States' defense relationship with it. What I'd like to do is share a perspective informed by some time in the U.S. government working to expand that partnership, as well as working with industry to focus on the defense trade side. And what I'm going to try to do is fit a couple of the issues you identified into specific categories to provide a bit of a broader overview of where we are in the defense relationship. one of the things I think is important to recall is that U.S.-India defense ties are actually very young. This is a young relationship. As was noted, for all practical purposes, it only dates back to about 2005. The first defense framework agreement between the two countries was signed in 1995, but because of the sanctions imposed in 1998, nothing really happened until that second agreement was signed in 2005. So that's a little over 10 years ago, and in that time, a lot of significant things have occurred. So what I want to do is talk about the convergence, really, of American interests and Indian interests in a way that helps explain where we are today and where we might go in terms of the future. It's often said that you got the world's largest democracy and the oldest democracy working together. You have two large English-speaking populations. You have an economy in India that's growing at a tremendous rate that has contributed directly to the American economy through not just the trade, but also the people-to-people relations with large numbers of Indians coming to the United States, working in areas like the tech sector, and then a lot of Indian Americans growing the relationship through their activities in academia, in business, in medicine, and increasingly in politics. So you have a lot of sort of general things that are bringing these two countries together, and in no area is that, I think, more clear than in defense. Now, the thing that has changed most dramatically in defense is obviously the end of the Cold War and the non-aligned movement division, but also the rise of China. And the fact that there is no country that can play the role that India can in mitigating some of the risks associated with China's rapid military expansion in Asia. There's just not a lot of countries with the demographic weight, the economic power, and the geographic location that could help mitigate some of the risks associated with the Chinese military growth. So there's a number of things that are bringing the U.S. and India closer together. It's the trade, it's some cooperation in defense and national security, but there's also some challenges that continue to sort of be a drag on that relationship over time, and some of that we've heard about, I think, from a particularly an Indian acquisition perspective, and I'll note a couple of those challenges. I think, on the one hand, the U.S., from a national security perspective, would like to see the Indian military to become more powerful than it is today, sort of full stop. I think that in itself is a fairly universal perspective within the U.S. national security community, that a strong Indian military is a good thing. And then secondarily, a strong Indian military that is interoperable with the U.S. military is also a good thing. And then thirdly, an Indian military that is actually procuring from the United States would even be more beneficial. And from the company's perspective, an Indian military whose industry, right, Indian industry is integrated with American industry is a fourth component of a positive trajectory for the relationship. And we've seen some of that occur. We've seen some of that occur, right, in part through the growth in the sales, right? So you got these platforms that the Air Marshal mentioned. We have right now an unprecedented offer for an armed UAV that, India will be the first non-allied country to be offered something like this. We see unprecedented offers of technology transfer from the United States government when it comes to defense that have been occurring over the last about 3 to 4 or 5 years. And we can go into some of the details on that. We see new agreements being penned between the two governments about advanced technology cooperation across the board. We're hoping to see additional agreements signed over the next year. And we're also seeing more discussion about interoperability and combined activities. When Prime Minister Modi came here about a year ago, he gave an excellent speech in front of the U.S. Congress in which he may have been the first prime minister to openly laud the U.S. military's role abroad. And that was, I think, a very important signal about where the Indian government is politically with respect to cooperation with the U.S. in defense. The political support for U.S.-India defense cooperation, both in Washington and Delhi, is really unique and probably unprecedented. In Washington, which I have a better sense of, obviously, than in Delhi, that's manifest through things like the declaration of India as a major defense partner in law. It's manifest through things like the renaming of the U.S. Pacific Command to be the Indo-Pacific Command. It's manifest right in these unprecedented technology release offers from the U.S. government, and just sort of a lot of legislative language and then statements from senior level officials from the president on down in both Democratic and Republican administrations that this is an important relationship. I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that U.S.-India defense ties is like an endangered species here in Washington. It is that rare issue that enjoys wide bipartisan support. Across the board. So that's the good, I think. That's where the opportunities are. That's where you see room for expansion. Now, there's also real challenges. Some of it, again, was alluded to already, but I think the issue about trust is important. I think you still feel some on the Indian side trust about the United States as a reliable defense provider, and this concern is born from historical experience of having lived under the era of sanctions in 1998. And so there are senior people in the Indian system that personally experienced that era of sanctions, and it's a difficult thing to overcome that when it's part of your own history. So I think it's important to recognize that remains a challenge, and it's important that we communicate that the political conditions here in the United States are fundamentally different than they were in 1998, and that we are, in fact, reliable, which is why some of the news that came out this morning is important. Those of you that might not have been focusing on this in detail, I'll just give the short history. But about last year, Congress passed legislation called the Countering American Adversaries Through Sanctions Act, CASA, and this was in direct response to the Russian interfering in the U.S. election. And among other things, this legislation basically said that sanctions would be imposed on any entity that conducts a significant transaction with the Russian military. Well, we can understand the motivation behind that legislation, but the reality is that the Indian military has been buying weapons from Russia for such a long time. It is dependent on the Russian military for sustainment of those systems. And if you put before the Indian government a choice between working with the United States in defense and cutting off all defense ties with Russia, it's really no choice, because their ground forces would literally come to a grinding halt in the absence of Russian sustainment of those systems. So it's really not a choice. And I'm pleased that this morning we saw the conference report come out from the Hill with language that I think reflects the need to provide a waiver for countries that are improving their defense relationship with the United States or reducing their defense procurements from the Russians. And I think it shows an understanding in Congress of the importance of sustaining the momentum in U.S.-India defense. There's also, frankly, another component of the NDAA that built on enhancing India's status as a major defense partner. So you had two different components of the NDAA, keeping the momentum moving in a positive direction with defense. A couple of other things I would just note in terms of the challenges, and this is more on the Indian side. And again, this is the perspective of somebody that's been working this from Washington and with American companies. India's defense acquisition system is not the most efficient in the world, and I'll just put it at that. And for American companies, America is a private sector-driven defense industry, right? It's not run by the government. So these private companies need to make decisions about investment in both time and money and capital in working in India, and the lack of sort of predictability in India's acquisition cycle. We heard about the MMRCA deal that is over how many years, how many decades are we going into?
13 years now already.
Right. So if you're a company, you need to justify to your shareholders why you're doing a campaign in a country where you can't be certain what the outcome is going to be. Not just you, but your predecessor may have left the company that you work for by the time this all gets resolved. So there's a timeliness and a predictability component. There's also a complexity component. India has been trying to become less reliant on imports, which is an understandable goal. But the ways that it has gone about doing that are not always the easiest for private companies to accommodate. This deals with things like offset arrangements and make in India components and technology control and things of that nature. Now, I think there's improvement on that, and I personally think that the more we see the Indian private sector get involved in defense manufacturing, the better, we'll just say the more pressure there will be to improve the efficiency of this acquisition system. And I know the Modi government has made that a priority, increasing Indian private sector involvement in defense. American companies, I think, are uniquely well positioned to partner with Indian companies in this endeavor, particularly because we have global supply chains that we can integrate those Indian companies into, so that not only do they feed the Indian military need, but they could potentially be exporters of military equipment abroad to markets that have been, American goods destined markets. But I'll sort of end on, I think, one issue that I think is of supreme importance and is often not focused on, and that is the issue of different visions for the defense partnership and how that relates to technology security. So, as was said, the Indian government and the Indian industry has had a strong appetite for the most advanced defense technology, particularly, and they've all asked for that from the United States. And while U.S. policies may be unprecedented in terms of how liberal they are with respect to India, there's still a limit to what the U.S. is going to authorize for export if there are not mechanisms in place that are agreed to that give both American industry and the U.S. government's assurance that that technology will not be diverted to a third party, particularly Russia. Right? And we see that in the NDA language that came out today, actually. It's explicitly in that NDA language, which is, waivers will not be imposed if basically there's a risk of technology diversion or lost. Now, that's a technical issue, but it actually relates to a broad political issue and a vision issue about what this partnership is. If you looked at what, and I want to cite a quote from Prime Minister Modi that he made at the Shangri-La Dialogue. So he said, quote, "President Putin and I shared our views on the need for a strong multipolar world order for dealing with the challenges of our times." And he went on to stress that India's, quote, "friendships are not alliances of containment." So that is an important quote, particularly when you juxtapose that over what you heard from Admiral Harris, the prior commander of Pacific Command. He noted, quote, "Great power competition is back. A geopolitical competition between free and oppressive visions is taking place in the Indo-Pacific." And then Secretary of Defense Mattis went on to say, "For those who want peace and self-determination, we all have a shared responsibility to work together to build our shared future." So what you're seeing on one hand is an Indian vision of multipolarity and basically hedging. And that's an understandable vision in a way from a country that lived under a Cold War dynamic where a lot of decisions were made in Washington and in Russia and Moscow. They didn't have control of a lot of that stuff. And they're seeing a multipolar world as a positive thing because now there's competing powers and India can exercise more influence. But on the American side, what you're seeing is an understanding of what it takes to manage a very specific security challenge, which is the rise of the Chinese military, and the need to build an actual partnership. And a partnership where you have to make choices between one group and another. To make this, the U.S. has now a history of forming blocs, coalitions, or alliances to counter specific threats. So if we're dealing with something in the Middle East, we form a coalition of countries to deal with that specific challenge. Or in Europe, we're dealing with specific challenges through a coalition formation. And it's a very straightforward balancing strategy, which is how you deal with the growth of one threat. Right? You balance it with a different coalition. So how does that relate to technology? And that's where I'll end. It relates to technology because at a certain point, you got to choose. You're either going to do a fifth generation fighter cooperation with the Russians, or you're going to do it with the U.S. Because no country is going to provide that kind of, not just technology, but also the intelligence and partnership unless there's a real partnership, right? And that requires choices. And I think there are these two different visions right now that have not come together, and we'll have to see over time how that all works itself out. So I'll end on that point.
Well, maybe we can get former National Security Advisor Shiv Shankar Menon to write choices too, and start to adjudicate some of these tensions. But before we do that, Professor Joanna Spear, if you could offer some.
Okay, thank you so much, and thanks to Stimson for hosting us, and for you all to come and talk with us on this important issue. I want to just make a couple of points, and I am neither an American nor an Indian, although I have great affinity for both countries. But my remarks are maybe one step removed and possibly a little more cynical than either of my colleagues have been so far. So I think India's vision for what it would like to achieve in terms of defense industry is to move from dependence to interdependence to independence. And that is a really hard road to take, particularly in a high technology world. And there have been many states that have tried to do it over the last 60, 70 years, and it's a real struggle. So what India's trying to achieve, others have tried to achieve too, and have found difficult. And I'll connect that up with another point in a minute. I think my colleagues have both quite rightly pointed to the issue of China as being the one that has really brought these two major powers together. India and the US have both got a considerable interest in what China does and what China's happening, what it's getting involved with. And we're in the era of global China. You know, they have interests in the Balkans, they're in South America, they're everywhere. So everybody's kind of focused on China. But India has another strategic interest, which is much more uncomfortable for the US, which is Pakistan, another US ally. Although the balance of where that alliance goes is changing. So whereas the US, in terms of the India relationship, has a very clear focus, India has two strategic problems to deal with and can see itself as in a pincer between China and its ally Pakistan. So that immediately complicates the picture. So the US has got a focus on one thing, but India needs to be focused on at least two things, if not more, in the region. So immediately you've got two powers with a common interest, but there are other things going on as well. I think the points that Ben made about multipolarity and India's traditional desire to not be in either of the camps and be more non-aligned is an important tradition to think of, and the world system as it is now, you know, with the rise of the BRICS, although I'd actually talk about the stalling of the BRICS at the moment, but the rise of the BRIC economies and things are changing, which again means India has different interests as well that are coming into play in how they're regarding things. So this is where the strategic relationship begins to get a little bit complicated, because the US is really engaged on the China issue, and if the China issue goes away, the US interest diminishes. The China issue is not going to go away, so that's not going to be a problem, but it does mean there's a real difference in focus there. And then a strategic relationship is on the state-to-state level. But India's also very interested in a defense industrial relationship, which on the US side is a private sector entity, but it would be engaging with a government, which is immediately an uncomfortable coming together, as had been indicated by some of the comments of both my colleagues here. So I think there are some things that muddy the waters of having a strategic relationship, just in those terms. I think the other thing to say is India's quite right to say, well, America has military-industrial partnerships with a number of states like NATO and Japan and Korea, so India should have this too. But the other bit of this is a lot of the NATO countries and Japan and Korea struggle a bit with this relationship with the US, because the US would be happiest if everybody just bought from them and stopped having an industry themselves. So there's a kind of the US is already extremely dominant in the international arms market. It has 85% of global arms sales. The Trump administration wants more. Where these more are going to come from, it's not quite clear, but one of the ways to make more is to push other states out of exporting and out of industry. So there's a tension there that other allies are feeling, which inevitably comes into play is India tries to build this relationship and do things as well. So I think it's a complicated picture. I think as well, I think Ben's made some very important points about what kind of an environment US industry needs to see in India before it will invest. And some of the things we've seen happening are, well, you might nicely call them evolving rules on procurement, on defense offsets, on joint ventures, foreign direct investment. And from the US side, it looks like the rules change a lot. And certainly in terms of offsets, the rules change about once every 2 or 3 years. The reason they change is India's trying to maximize what they get out of them because defense offsets haven't been delivering. They've not been giving to India what India wants, so they're kind of tweaking with the rules and changing the percentages in a hope to make them really work. The problem is that US defense industries and other defense industries who accept offsets as part of a deal are more interested in the deal than in the defense offsets. They just want to be able to tick the box and say, yes, we did a 1.5 multiplier on that, you know, we did this, it's gone. Whereas the Indians are really seeking industrial development through this, and it's a very, very difficult tool to make work well. And we can look at the efforts of Saudi Arabia and the UAE and Australia to really hone their defense offsets policies so they really do what they want them to do. If you look globally, the most that defense offsets have really been able to do is to integrate defense industries into the global supply chain, but as subcomponent suppliers or maybe repairers or something like that. But they haven't been really able to make that fighter aircraft to do that. So it's kind of a hard thing to achieve. And this is what India's running up against, and this is what India's really trying to work around. So along with all that, I think I would also say that there are other defense industries that are more desperate to deal with India than America. Because America has a lot of market. It can make demands about, you know, the business conditions it encounters. It can make demands quite rightly about protection of technology transfer. There are a number of other fairly well industrialized players who cannot play with those demands because they need the sales, which is why you have the French saying, yes, we'll give you everything. Yes, you can have the source codes. Yes, you can do this, because they need the sales. But even they then began to walk back when the details of the MMRCA came out. So you can see why these conflicts are emerging and why they're so difficult to deal with. And US industry has no compunction about walking away from something if it gives away too much or it's not going to be profitable enough. And no strategic relationship is going to change that, even though the US government has facilitated as much as it can the environment for US-Indian defense trade. They're not going to impose more than that. They can't go further. So it does mean that probably in the future the US will not be the major supplier because there are other states who are willing to go further, give more. It's music to India's ears when you get told you can get the source codes so you can actually modify systems to work in a way that India needs them to work. It's very, very attractive. So I think there are all these things going on. I'm now going to make a quick point about something that's very uncomfortable for India, and that's corruption. And I don't actually mean current corruption. I actually mean the perception of corruption. So one of the things that tends to happen in Indian procurement is that you get so far along in the process and there's a whiff of corruption somewhere. Something maybe, wasn't quite straight, there was maybe a payment or something, it's very opaque. That is enough to stop a deal. Because of Indian experience of corruption in the past, It can bring down a minister, just the idea that there's been something going on, not even any proven reality to it. And this has slowed down a number of different defense projects over time. Not proven, but just enough to make politicians go, AK Anthony, Saint Anthony, I'm not going near that because there's a whiff of corruption about it. Then what happens is there's a strategic need, and they rush out and buy something because they stop that procurement project because of corruption. So there's a kind of a stop-go phenomenon. And it's part of Indian culture. It's used in domestic politics to, undermine a person, but it can stop a deal and things like that. It can slow down indigenous development. So these are important things that play into the process. And then the final point I'll make is about organizational culture. Now, it is said that when the British were in India, they gifted them bureaucracy, and then India perfected it. So, first of all, I apologize for that as a heritage British person. The Indian system is very bureaucratic. It can be very difficult to make things move along. And actually, a lot of the corruption there is in the system is extremely petty, and it's just to move a file from one desk to another. It's not I got $1 billion for facilitating this deal. It's very tiny things, which don't necessarily speak to the integrity of a defense industrial project, but nevertheless. But one of the things about this organizational culture is you have this cadre of people who work in the bureaucracy for many decades, who are resistant to change, who see themselves as the beating heart of India and know what's best for India, and it's very, very difficult to change. It is beginning to change, and the defense industry, the fact that the Indian private sector is now allowed to play and become involved in joint ventures and this kind of thing is beginning to change things. But this is very, very difficult for an organization. Organizational change is always very difficult. So I think that's a real challenge. DRDO's done some interesting things, like it's been trying to attract back, to make the boomerang work of Indians who came to America to be in technology or software or engineering. They've been trying to draw them back in to join the defense industrial sector to really push this modernization through. I'd be interested to know how that's going, but it was a very smart plan. I don't know how much it works. So they're really trying to change the culture, but cultural change is hard. And just to speak a little bit about US organizational culture, the US thinks that the rest of the world should look like them. I don't know if any of you've had the experience I have. I've been at a number of defense industrial events in India where Americans just stand up and say, you should reorganize and do it like us. And I think it would be so helpful in the American system to be a little bit more sensitive to how India does things and to not expect them to work in the same way, to actually think about how India is set up and bring the appropriate people to a meeting and things like that. Not just say, I'm in DOD, I'm going to meet MOD, therefore everything will be okay, but actually think, well, what does MOD over there do? Who do we need in the room? Should I bring other people from the government? Should I have a more whole of government approach to get this to work? And with that, I'll finish. So thank you so much.
Thanks, Joe. I was going to follow this with a question that was really a statement, and I decided I was just going to make a quick statement, and then we'll just open up to other questions, and we can potentially reflect on it later. But it does strike me that this whole proposition of the building the U.S. India military-industrial relationship is not just an opportunity, but there are costs involved, and we don't maybe pay enough attention in enumerating what those costs are, both at the strategic level as well as the operational level. So I thought I'd sort of walk through them real quick, because we've kind of drawn them out in this conversation today. So the first is an opportunity cost, which Ben alluded to, right? You can spend a lot of time trying to sort of build this capacity, not just for immediate sales, but for sort of long-term capacity, but it can be stymied at any point along the way because of bureaucracy, because of corruption, because of political interests. And it is that uncertainty and the opportunity cost comes in because the United States could be doing this with other partners. It could be sort of deepening its relationship with its existing allies or cultivating new ones, for example, like Indonesia or Vietnam, which are other countries that were excluded from that CATSA provision. Besides those opportunity costs, you have actual direct material costs. Again, we've talked about that. We're talking about offsets, discounts, or technology transfers. And technology transfers that are, as Joe alluded to, India's interest in them is to move from dependence to interdependence to independence, which means they will be a future competitor. If we sort of commit to the idea that we're going to use the F-16 as a sort of a platform to get India to be jointly manufacturing or producing the F-35, is that then a competitor to U.S. industry in some way, or is it a pure joint venture? I mean, but there are other areas where if India sort of reverse manufactures things and starts to sell them, they are a competitor to U.S. industry. The third is leakage and transfer, which is, again, something that Ben talked about, right? So the risk of technology leaking out to other sources, whether violations of intellectual property, or more concerning, I think, is that this leaks to U.S. adversaries that India has a relationship with. And Russia is one of them. Iran is one of them. There's not a strategic relationship between India and Iran, but there is a relationship there that I think the U.S. does also worry about. And the fifth one is one that we didn't really talk about that much, I think Joe alluded to, and that is counteractions by other states in the region, right? So it is not simply a costless exercise to say we're going to try to build up India as a net security provider. Even if we've dehyphenated India from Pakistan, we can't dehyphenate consequences. And there are consequences to us doing this, which is that Pakistan is going to react based on what is in its strategic interest. And that might mean digging deep on tactical nuclear weapons to offset India's growing conventional advantage. Does that lead to net security in the region? It's something I don't think we've actively tried to weigh because we tend to bifurcate this issue in the name of dehyphenization. But it is something worth considering. And the other part of this is not simply the Pakistan equation. You talk to other actors in the Indian Ocean region, a lot of those states see that the idea of bolstering India as a net security provider is seen as a direct threat to them. We think of it as totally benign. As a regional hegemon, they will be a net security provider for the region. But there are other actors there that might be not so comfortable with that and then actively invite China in for a strategic, for an economic or political relationship, or sometimes even a strategic relationship. And so that is a concern that I don't think we weigh that consequence into our decision making as much as we should. And even if the result is we still say on average the benefits outweigh the costs, I don't think we've done a sufficient job with weighing those costs and benefits. But I'll leave it at that, and then I will turn it over to our audience. We have about 15 minutes for Q&A, so I'm probably just going to start by bundling about 2 or 3 questions at a time, and we'll just open it up to the panel to give a response. So let's start with give your name, your question in the form of a question, and keep it succinct. So I see one hand in the back, and then we'll go to you.
Hi, okay, so my name is Riyanka Shah, and speaking of other state actors within the region, something that has been on my mind is the upcoming Pakistan elections. And my question is, how much of the US and India's military-industrial relationship have to do with Pakistan? And will there be a change in strategy with knowing what the election outcome will be tomorrow or day after?
Okay, let me add a second question. The gentleman right in front, yeah.
Thank you very much for giving ask the question. My question is...
Can you identify yourself?
Okay. My name is Satoru Nagao, working in the Hudson Institute currently. And my question for the respectable Air Marshal. In my opinion, India still hesitates to import any weapon from United States. But one of the reasons India cannot expect much support from the United States in crisis. So if India faces Dogram-type crisis or China's blackmail, what kind of support India wish to get from United States is my question. Thank you very much.
All right, why don't we get one more in here, up here in the front.
Hi, my name is Liv Dowling. I work at OSC Policy at the Department of Defense. My question is, what role do you see smaller industry within India, the innovation sector, the startup sector, having in defense industry?
Great, so we'll take those 3. We've got questions on the Pakistan elections, U.S. support in a crisis, China-India crisis, Stockholm, and smaller industry. So do you want to start, sir?
Yeah, fine, okay. Well, with respect to Pakistan elections, Indo-Pak relations, that is something which India strongly believes that it has to be dealt bilaterally, and we will deal with it. So the U.S. wants to relate that issue with respect to the rest of the relationship between India and U.S. I think that's, this is an area which has always been a disagreement between the two sides. And India always says that dealing that part, you deal with Pakistan how you want to deal with it. But we have a very clear perception about Pakistan. We have a very clear understanding as to a state that supports terrorism in a big way. And therefore, Indian position is not going to change in that area. So it's not going to make a difference. But it's a U.S. decision, internal decision with respect, but they have other geopolitical considerations that come into play. But I think from indications of how U.S. has made statements recently and how various issues have played out, I think the U.S. is also moving out. That geopolitical consideration is largely a Cold War issue, and much of that is changing, and therefore it depends what happens in Afghanistan, how U.S. takes decisions in that area, how it treats Pakistan. I think much of it is between U.S. and Pakistan. But if they want to use that to impact on this thing, the defense cooperation, defense industrial relationship, that I think would be a mistake, and I don't think they would do that. That's one issue. With respect to Doklam, in the context of dealing with challenges, I think India is pretty much sure that it will deal much of it with itself. So Doklam, it didn't depend on anybody else's, material support for it, for dealing with that issue. India is fully capable, even though we have a lot of, modernization problems with respect to force structure issues, but I think we have enough strength and enough capabilities to deal with those kind of crises, even if it should arise in the future. But India is very conscious of how the rest of the world sees it, and that's where U.S. comes into play. So the logic and the fairness of India's position is India will be very conscious of how the rest of the world views it, and therefore the relationship between India and U.S. and India and the other countries will matter a lot on how the rest of the world perceives who's on the right side and who's on the wrong side, and that matters a lot. So I think relationship comes into play only in that context, not in the context of material support. Or if I go back to 1971, how the Indo-USSR Friendship Treaty was devised to bring in support of the USSR for India in the Security Council. I think those kind of situations, I don't foresee that, in the future. But India has grown much beyond those kind of requirements in the current, stage. Small industries, that's a welcome change that's actually emerging in India. Bangalore is actually the most attractive destination for startup industries and innovation. I think if you notice the innovation rankings that various international organizations put out, India has been climbing the rankings quite in the last few years. And I personally deal with some of them, and I personally advise some of those industries. I think there is a lot of potential, there's a lot of passion that comes into play, and where most of them get impacted is funding, because they are all passionate about technologies. They don't make a good business case, and they're not, experts in dealing with that. There they need support, and there are a lot of policy changes that the government has brought in the Department of Science and Technology, the Global Innovation Technology Agency that they've created. A lot of funding is available. The problem is many of these small players are not aware of these policy changes and what facilities the government has made available. And that awareness program is going in a big way. We have, for example, the CIA, which is the Association of Industries, has created a specific division called Society for Indian Defense Manufacturers, which is going about in a big way in creating that kind of an awareness program. So there is a realization, and this is the mistake that India made over the last 50 years, is that you focused your defense production on public sector units. Much of it is in licensed production. You just completely missed out there's a ladder of production where the intermediate steps are about repair, overhaul, and spares, and aggregate production. That is where the ecosystem of small and medium industries come into play. They've never created that. And this realization has come now, particularly I've mentioned that in my report as well, and I've also said it's time to wind up the Department of Defense production because it's counterproductive for the entire process, because they bat only for the public sector units, and create a ministry of industry, heavy industry, a ministry of aerospace industry, and bring about this entire change. There is a realization in the government. I'm particularly having interacted with them. There's a lot of realization on that, and there's a lot of attempt to facilitate that. So Niti Aayog also plays a role in bringing in that kind of a change. That's it.
Joe, do you want to add something?
A quick comment on small and medium enterprises, not necessarily addressed to the high technology ones, but often an agreement to have a company, a foreign company, move into the Indian market will come with a demand that they do a certain amount of business with small and medium enterprises. The crisis comes when, as soon as you begin to deal with them, they cease to be a small and medium enterprise because your business is so big. So IKEA ran into this, that they'd begin to deal with the business. It would become so big it falls out of the SME category. And then the question was, well, do you then need to find a new partner, or are you allowed to carry on? So there wasn't a total thinking through of that policy, shall we say. In terms of what they want on Pakistan, I think stability is the ideal.
Elusive.
Yeah, and we should probably know on a kind of a crisis with Pakistan that the fighting in Kashmir over the last 18 months has been the most intense we've seen in decades. And we're outside of the region. It's not really got that much attention at all, which is our problem, I think. So I'll leave it there.
I guess the only comment I'd make on the SME issue would be that you're dealing with, when it comes to the defense industry, you're dealing with an monopsony, right? So everything really depends on the buyer.
Yeah.
The Indian industry has done a remarkable job selling in a free-ish market, free-ish, right? Where there's customers that can have the freedom to choose one thing to buy or something else. But you need the Indian government to make the buys. And if the Indian government, in this case the acquisition system, is inconsistent, it can't support these SMEs. The companies, frankly, that have done the best, the OEMs anyway, in Indian defense, are those that have had both the civilian side of the company, like Boeing, and the military side. So that when the military sales are slow, that company can sustain revenue through the civil sales, like civilian aircraft. But obviously, small companies are not in a position to do that.
I'll just add a bit on this small and medium
Very quick, because
industry
we want to
issue.
get one round of
Yeah.
questions.
One is we also need to appreciate that the industrial, the basis on which new developments take place and innovation takes place is also changing. That means basically you're moving away from industrial revolution model to a more knowledge revolution basis. And here the IT capabilities, your mathematical ability to develop algorithms, they all will matter a lot as you go along. And therefore, this is a huge, and a lot of young Indians realize that. There's a huge opportunity where India has an opportunity to leapfrog and catch up in some of the areas. But it still will not, get you away from those requirements of developing materials, developing, manufacturing capability, etc. But I think here's a huge opportunity. And in that context, the company, for example, a chip designer company who's designed and who has about 12 patents, including the US patents, has developed into further development on applications. And it's a natural process which invites a US firm to come and invest in a big time into the small company. Okay, and that's happened in the last 1 year. So I think here opportunities are rising in this area.
Okay, so we'll take 3 more questions. I think that'll be the last one. So we'll start right here in the front with Rizwana. Wait 1 second, wait for the mic.
Thank you. My question is actually directed to you, which is twofold. Number one, is there any probability of future broader confrontation between China and India, considering their trade volume that has crossed actually over $100 billion on yearly basis? Number two, does China has any leverage on India to play a role as a moderator in a crisis situation between Pakistan and India in the near future?
go back here.
Sylvia Mishra, Nuclear Threat Initiative. I'm curious to know your thoughts about stationing of an Indian naval attaché in Bahrain. How far do you think that this step goes on to bolstering interoperability in the maritime domain, especially in the Western Indian Ocean, where a strategic congruence between security goals of the United States and India are not that aligned? Thank you.
Indian naval attaché in Bahrain.
In Bahrain.
Bahrain, the U.S.'s naval force.
Okay.
Okay. Do we have one more over here? No? Oh, here.
Akriti Vasudeva from Stimson. My question is, India has sort of focused on wanting to build industrial defense base indigenously, but at what cost is my question. So, we've seen the delays and quality issues with weapon systems that have been developed in India, and we've seen that the offset policy hasn't worked. So, you've put in so much money, but you haven't got a return on investment. Then why not sort of continue to go with foreign weapon systems and then maybe domestically just focus on critical resources like ammunition and spare parts? So what is the logic of doing that? That's my
I'm
question.
going to add a sharpened end to that, which is I heard someone from U.S. industry say to me, how can you be confident in India's attention to quality control and sort of quality manufacturing when most of the buildings you walk into, the walls don't meet? And maybe he's being a little facetious, but I mean, there is a serious question about sort of whether there's sort of a culture of sort of that quality as well. So anyway, so those three questions, we got Indian confrontation on India-China on trade, leverage on India for in a crisis, a naval attaché in Bahrain, and what costs indigenization. So we'll start with you for.
Okay. Answer to the second question. China trying to play mediator between India and Pakistan is an out of question. India will never accept that. And not that China has never hinted at that. I think quite recently they made a statement, something similar. But politely, I think India has told them, stay off. Pakistan would want, they just want mediators from anyone, whether U.S., China, anybody else from anywhere. Okay, but that's not going to happen. So we can rule that out. With respect to threat and the possibility of India-China issue, as long as you have a border dispute that's more than half a century old, and the reasons are far more complex than it is just an alignment of the boundary line. It's to do with integration of Tibet into China. It's to do with Tibetan people. It's to do with Dalai Lama. It's to do with India's continued sustenance of the Tibetan government in exile, and a whole lot of complexities come into the entire process. So this, is one factor could create a kind of a crisis like Doklam ever again. But more importantly, what worries India is that the expansion of Chinese influence in Indian Ocean. So Hambantota port has gone for a 99-year lease, and this is where I think it's a huge loss for India's influence there. And Maldives has gone out of India's hands. Nepal is pretty much on a similar issue. The CPEC is moving at a rapid pace in Pakistan. So there are a lot of worries with respect to China, and China is the elephant in the room, is the biggest threat that India sees. Notwithstanding the bonhomie on the Wuhan summit, notwithstanding the bonhomie on the BRICS and the SCO admittance of India, but underlying, it's like the Thucydides explanation, the underlying fear continues to, and as long as that cause remains, there is always a problem for a conflict. But I would say both are matured powers, both are mature nuclear weapon states, and therefore any kind of an escalation into unmanageable level, I don't see it at all. But you could create problems, and it won't be from India's side, it would be from China's side, to fundamentally try and downsize India to, in the international image. And that's what backfired in Doklam, actually. So you can't rule that out. With respect to the second question, who was that? Okay.
Naval.
Yeah.
Bahrain.
In Bahrain.
Yeah.
That's an alignment, and that is the real strategic interests that are aligning between U.S. and India. The naval alignment on strategic interests is quite, it's progressed quite well. And therefore, I think it's a good development. One of the setback that happened was with respect to Seychelles and what we wanted to develop as a port there. But that's temporary in my opinion. It will still happen over a period of time. So when that happens, then probably, and I think the Indian focus is on how do we now set right the losses that we've had in Hambantota and Maldives and try and recover those areas through these processes. And I think here both the countries will work together quite well. Indigenization, yes, and I think I will combine what Joanna has also mentioned on the offset issue. I was a member of the first offset committee in 2005. And, we did a lot of homework. Offset has to be looked at. See, offset adds more cost. No OEM actually gives it to you, free of cost. He packs up that offset, obligation as well into his cost, and everybody knows that. Why do a country needs an offset process? Is a way how you actually plug in deficiencies through leveraging your huge contracts by forcing him to invest in those areas. It cannot be simply a buyback counter trade process. Correct? And that's what it happened. So the offset has a direct element and an indirect element. And I think pretty much the chairman who was in the first committee was a former chairman of the Hindustan Aeronautics Limited. He didn't understand the process. In fact, the bureaucracy said, we want to keep it simple. Let's keep it as simple as possible. So when it started in 2005, they said, just tell them to invest 30% in direct costs and let them buy back whatever we give. I mean, you didn't, as the offset started flowing in, you didn't have the capability, you didn't have the capacity in the Indian industry, nor did you have the capability to supply what you wanted. And therefore, till 2012, $4.8 billion of offset commitments, not $1 was actually, used up. Scene has changed now. Much of it is moving quite fast track. And therefore, that flawed system was first revised well in 2013. So you brought in the multiplication factors, you brought in investments in joint ventures, you brought in enabling factors for investment in small and medium industries. And once the medium industry grows into big, it's not going to change. The policy will, as long as you're a partner, you'll continue to, derive the benefits till you exhaust the obligation part. The DRDO element came in, which I think is not a good idea. I think you need to actually pull in those kind of investments into your research and development in the academic institutes, into research and development institutes, get into joint development programs. This is how I think offset needs to get engineered. We've lost 10 years in the offset policy, very badly, implemented policy. Implementation has been a problem. Implementation is the problem. And then DOMW, which is responsible for implementing offsets, there are no experts who understand the offset processes. You need technocrats and people from the industry to actually man the implementation mechanism. And that is how the industry will know where I want. Offset has to be leveraged. You can't tell the guy who's giving you offset to choose what he wants to give. He'll give you nothing, right? And similarly, in the technology area, with respect to while U.S., any country won't give technology, yes, what Joanna said is right. The French or the European agency who need more business, or they're more, hell-bent on getting the business, may promise anything, but nobody gives technology. And believe me, I've seen the full process over a 20-year period, and people have gone back on their words, citing their national provisions, and the French have been experts at that. They don't give 1 inch. In fact, they are worse than the Americans in terms of parting with technology. Okay, so the Indian system should understand this process. Nobody is going to give you technology for free. You have to leverage. Learn from the Chinese. They've been masters at it. And this is what I keep telling them. Okay, and then it's not going to happen overnight. Suddenly you can't jump from manufacturing a small low-end technology to the top end of 5th generation technology, or 6th generation technology. You've got to go through certain steps. You can leapfrog, but first 2 steps you can't skip. And therefore, the strategy has to be laid out well. And this strategy has to be a wholesome strategy at a national level, which has to be overseen by the political leadership and then implemented through the appropriate people.
Okay, Ben, 30 seconds, any last words?
No, I think
That was
you covered it
fast.
pretty well.
Joe?
Nope.
Also fast. Well, thank you guys all for joining us today. Apologies for getting started a little late. I hope you got your money's worth. If you didn't, pick up a cookie on the way out, but we'll hopefully see you again soon.
Thank you. Thank you.